During a season when daylight wanes and nights begin to grow long and frosty, Brooks River is still very much alive. Brown bears, who seem to have an unlimited stomach capacity, seek to satisfy their hunger, while spawning salmon attempt to complete their life's work. Hello, and welcome to this live chat brought to you by Katmai National Park and explore.org. My name is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explore. And today I'm joined by Naomi, a longtime bear cam fan who is now a ranger with the Katmai Conservancy in Katmai National Park. And today we're discussing late summer and fall at Brooks River, specifically what this season means for brown bears and salmon that call this place home. This is the second peak season on bear cam. It's really a time of the year that offers brown bears their last opportunity to gain the fat reserves necessary to survive winter hibernation. So it's a really great time of the year to talk brown bears and salmon. And Naomi, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, I'm really happy to be here today and looking forward to September here for the first time.
Yeah, September is one of my favorite times of the year at Brooks River. So I'm not gonna be up there this year, but I'm gonna be living vicariously through the webcams, of course, just like everyone else. So Naomi will be there filling us in, of course, throughout most of the month. And if you have questions for Naomi and I about brown bears and salmon at Brooks River in late summer and early fall, then drop those questions in the chat below the streaming window on explore.org. So just scroll down to the bottom of the page. You'll see the chat there. Throw your questions in there, and the helpful moderators from Explore will send those in our direction. So we'll be looking for those questions throughout the chat. And then at the end, if we can't answer those questions during the chat, at the end of the broadcast, we'll try to get to those as best we can. But Naomi, to begin, I think maybe we should put ourselves in the mindset of a brown bear and think about how their world largely revolves around food, to maybe understand why bears are able to make a living at Brooks River in both early and late summer. We might have to consider their food source. We might have to consider the main type of food that they're looking for at this time of the year, and that happens to be salmon. So can you kind of walk us through the salmon life cycle so we can get an understanding of those fish? Because I think that is very, very important into gaining understanding on how the brown bears are using this place.
Yeah, I mean, this place is all about the salmon, and that's why we get to watch brown bears here. So the salmon are briefly, they're born here in fresh water, and then they move on to the ocean in salt water, which makes them anadromous. That's the long scientific word for being both freshwater and saltwater. So their life begins here in the streams and the rivers as an egg, and then when they eat through the yolk of that egg, and it's under gravel, and then they come out and they live in the streams and rivers for a while, and then they grow into what are called fry. Fry live in fresh water for 2 to 3 years, and then the fry get a little bigger and they become what's called smolt, and the smolt then go out into salt water where they are there for 2 to 3 years, maybe longer, and they grow and they circulate in the oceans for that length of time. After, say, 3 or so years, they have this mechanism in their brain that says, time to go back to where I was from in that fresh water, and time to reproduce. So they make their way back to the rivers and streams where they were born, sometimes to the exact place where they were born. And that's when we see them earlier in the season. No dogs here. That's where we see them.
One of my neighbors.
Okay. I miss dogs here. So they come back, they make their way back into the fresh water here in Brooks River, and that's when we've been seeing them jumping the falls in July and hanging around at the base of the falls. And they do that until they spawn. And when the spawning process is the females lay the eggs in gravel, and they kick up the gravel and deposit it there, and then the males fertilize it, and then those become the eggs that become the future salmon. And a few weeks after they spawn, both the males and females die. And here at Brooks River, when those fish have been upriver or they've spawned in the river, they float downstream. And that's why we have a lot of bears in the lower river um, here at Brooks Falls. So, but I do have a question for you, Mike, which is, how long is that spawning process for the salmon here at Brooks Falls?
Well, the actual sort of spawning process happens, I think, fairly quickly. Um, the spawning season, however, can last several weeks. Brooks River actually has this weird, uncommon duality compared to most streams in Katmai National Park. To give you more of a typical example, the typical salmon-bearing stream in Katmai will have salmon move in, spawn, die, all within a matter of a few weeks, maybe 2-3 weeks at most. But Brooks River has salmon in and around it for, well, since from middle of June all the way through sometimes the middle of October. So it's a very broad time period where salmon are at Brooks River. So it's this weird uncommon duality that goes on. Bears find access to salmon here in early summer because of the falls, particularly. Brooks Falls provides a temporary barrier to migrating salmon, so that allows bears to catch the fish during that early migration period when they otherwise might not be accessible to the bears without that topographical barrier. But then something odd happens with the fish that spawn in Brooks River, because normally, like I mentioned before, in a lot of those salmon streams, where the salmon move in and they spawn and they die. I mean, they move in and then the spawning takes place for those fish within a matter of days. So a female might, lay her eggs, bury the eggs, try to protect her nesting site, but then she's pretty much spent. Her energy is spent. She might be able to survive a few more days after that, but really that's about it. So they have a very short window of opportunity to live after they have spawned. But the salmon in Brooks River end up delaying their spawning. And I think that's because of a couple of different reasons. One of them, maybe the main reason, is just water temperature in Brooks River itself. Brooks River is fed by by Lake Brooks. So it's this big lake at the head of the watershed itself. And when the water in Lake Brooks flows into Brooks River, it's a little bit warmer than what you would expect to find in some of the other streams in Katmai. So the salmon really have to wait for that water temperature to drop to the right conditions before they'll move in and spawn. So a lot of the salmon that we see coming here in early summer, they end up swimming through Brooks River, and a lot of those will spawn in tributaries off of Lake Brooks, but a lot of those just stage in the lakes, either at the inlet of Brooks River or the outlet. So they'll just kind of hang there waiting for the water temperature in the river to lower just enough for them to find the right conditions to lay their eggs, because water temperature really is the main thing that dictates the spawning period, the incubation period for salmon eggs. So if you lay your eggs in water that's too warm, your eggs are going to incubate too quickly. So they're really waiting for that right time of the year. And that's what's happening right now. This is the peak spawning season for salmon in Brooks River. It's not when those salmon first arrive, even though this is really still, all these sockeye salmon that we're seeing in the river are still part of the same run of fish. A lot of these fish have been here for weeks. They got here in July and they were just waiting this whole entire time. And that, is maybe a good opportunity, or a good point to transition onto, I think, one of the next things that we wanted to talk about, Naomi, and that's how bears sort of modify their behavior to take advantage of these spawning salmon in late summer, because it's a different dynamic than what we saw earlier in the year when those salmon were just trying to get through Brooks River as quickly as they can. Because right now, after the salmon start to spawn and die, we're going to start to see the fish doing something else, correct?
Right. Well, yeah, we're going to see those dead and dying and weak fish, which are a lot easier to catch. Sometimes when I'm at the falls, people ask me, well, why aren't the bears going for all the fish that are around their feet? And well, it's one, it's too deep, and two, those fish still have energy and they move away. They sense the bears are there, but when they're dead and dying, they don't have the capacity to move away from the bears. And the bears also are, as much as we see them eat during during July, when it comes to September, they are eating anything and everything, and they're not so fussy, and they will eat all those dead and dying salmon. And there's a physiological reason for that. The bears, before September, you'll see these carcasses of salmon, all these salmon fillets that we would like to eat, but the bears have discarded it because they are what is called high grading, eating the fattiest parts of the fish. But when it comes to September, their bodies change, and they go into what is called hyperphagia. And this is where they cannot get that sense that they're full. And we see bears like 747 here, who is so fat. And you think, okay, well, he's so fat he can barely walk right now. He's got to stop eating. But his metabolism and him has changed, and it's telling him, eat, eat, eat. And what's actually happening is that what happens with the bears is insulin allows the fat cells to grow in size and store more fat. That's great for bears for the winter and for fat bear contests. But then leptin, which is a hormone, should tell the bear's brain, okay, I've had enough to eat. I've got my fat cells are full and I should stop eating. But what happens is that switch of leptin doesn't work in the fall. It's if leptin's not working at all, and those bears do not know that they're full. So 747 is going to keep on eating, and they'll be down at the lower river eating all those dead and dying salmon, even though I suspect they probably don't taste as good as the salmon in July. And then that switch changes. That switch changes for them in late October, and the leptin actually kicks in. And what's interesting about the leptin is that humans have leptin too. And when humans break their sleep cycle, like if you work a night shift, your leptin doesn't work well either, and you don't feel sated, you don't feel satiety, you want to keep eating too. So it's something that human researchers are looking into to see what exactly is that leptin mechanism.
Yeah, it's a fascinating perspective to think about experiencing. I mean, bears are really experiencing a hunger on a level that humans can't, normally experience or even really imagine. So I will watch these bears, and when we're seeing them sitting in the river eating and eating and eating, and and taking in tens of thousands of calories per day. Well, on good days, sometimes closer to 50,000 calories or 100,000 calories. I mean, that's not necessarily an exaggeration. We've seen bears catching and eating enough fish to estimate their caloric intake per day, and it does range sometimes 50 to 100,000 calories per day at this time of the year. So it is really incredible to think about not only the capacities of their stomach, but also to think about their bodies going through this transition where they just don't feel full, and that is that process that they're going through called hyperphagia. So it's that physiological thing that they go through. It's also behavioral as well, because they'll be spending most of their waking hours in the search for food. Unlike earlier in the year where maybe the season kind of distracts them from feeding, and they might be out, prowling the landscape looking for mates. That's not necessarily the case at this time of the year. They still will interact with one another. They'll still play with one another. We'll see, bears doing bear things, throughout September and October. But that urge to eat is becoming stronger and stronger with them. And I think that's, one of the behaviors that we can observe them doing at the river, as well as, it's a physiological state that they're experiencing inside of them. But as we think about what's happening throughout the rest of the month, Naomi, we're going to start. We're still seeing a lot of bears fishing at Brooks Falls, but we're going to start to see a lot of bears looking for some dead and dying salmon at the mouth of Brooks River.
There we go, the underwater cam. So Mike, I have a question for you. We've been seeing lately, we've been seeing all the boars at the falls. And how much do the boars come downriver? Do they come downriver as well?
Yes and no. It depends on the bear. The majority of the large adult males seem to avoid the lower river area, especially when people are active. But that's something that we can see, on the bear cams when we're watching very early in the morning or late in the evening, or after Brooks Lodge closes for the season. And the last night to stay in the lodge is September 17th or 18th? I can't remember. But after that, there are no more guests at Brooks Lodge. So we'll still be park employees like yourself there, as you know. There will be some people staying in the campground, but far fewer people visiting Brooks River at that time. So we might see an increase in those large adult males using the lower river after September 18th. But within my experience, those big males, they tended to avoid areas where people are dispersed throughout the river corridor. So they'll visit that area when people are active, but maybe a bit more cryptically. They might do it in early in the morning or very late in the evening when there aren't a lot of people around. And when we see them, any of the bears really in the lower river, one of the kind of points I wanted to get to maybe before we transition to our final point and our conclusion before the broadcast, and we start to answer your questions, is just how bears are using the lower river, how they're using it as a place to scavenge for dead and dying salmon. I think that's a really important consideration because bears can make a good living in the lower Brooks River during September and October, and they'll do it just by like you see right here, swimming through the river. That's a technique we call snorkeling. They'll put their faces in the water, really looking for anything they can't swim away. So they're picking up dead and dying fish, the fish that maybe aren't as caloric, don't have as much energy in their bodies as the salmon fresh from the ocean, but they're really easy to catch. So it's very easy for bears to go through the river just patrolling it like a battleship, looking for anything they can't swim away. And the catch rate in the lower river in September can be very, very high. I've counted within 2 hours a bear picking up and scavenging over 40 fish. And they're maybe not eating the whole fish. They're maybe selecting out some of the choicer parts that maybe aren't as rotten, but they're still taking in a lot of calories. So the lower river is actually one of the best places for bears to be in September and October.
So what kind of changes can we expect as we move forward here? What kind of changes in the river?
Well, I would expect to find more bears fishing in the lower Brooks River compared to what we saw, especially in July. In July, we saw some bears down there, but we didn't see a lot of bears actively fishing down there. I mean, they were doing it from time to time, but it's since the area where food is found is just spread out over a broader area, it's going to maybe look like there are fewer bears using the lower river area compared to Brooks Falls, but it's actually the reverse. You might have a few bears fishing up at Brooks Falls consistently, but you're going to have downstream of the falls bears fishing pretty much everywhere. And it's not uncommon sometimes when there's a lot of bears at Brooks River to stand at the lower river platform and see a dozen bears within your line of sight, sometimes 20 different bears. I think the record, a former ranger at Katmai National Park told me that he once saw 40 bears within his line of sight from the lower river platform, which is kind of incredible. And that was in very late September. So that's one of the things to look forward to. I'm going to start watching the lower river cameras more as we progress closer towards October, because the number of bears are just going to increase at Brooks River throughout the month. The peak number of bears that we see at Brooks River usually in the fall, that usually doesn't happen until very late September and early October.
And I assume part of that is because of, the people, most of the people have left and there's, less to interfere with their fishing.
I think that's certainly a factor in the number of bears that we see using the lower Brooks River, because a lot of those bears that come to the river in the fall are a bit more cryptic. They don't seem nearly as tolerant of the presence of people as a lot of the bears that use the river during the middle of July, for instance. So if you are thinking about visiting in September, you're staying after the lodge closes, do be cognizant of that fact that a lot of the bears that are using the river at that time of the year may need a little bit of extra space. And you want to give bears, of course, space for your own safety, but you want to make sure that they also have space to access the resources they need to survive. So that's just something to consider. Maybe staying on the wildlife viewing platforms would be one of the better things to do in September to make sure that that bears have the maximum amount of space to access the river itself. But really, it just happens to, the other main factor that I should mention before I forget is that the other salmon spawning streams in Katmai have just played out by the end of September. And that's why we see a lot of bears coming back to the river, because of this, again, that duality that we talked about at the beginning of the broadcast. Bears have access to salmon in Brooks River in early summer, but they also have access to salmon in late summer, while most of the other runs have played out. The salmon have spawned, they died. There's really nothing left for bears to eat at those other salmon streams. So Brooks River is not only one of the first places in the central part of Katmai National Park where bears can gain access to salmon, but it's one of the last places that they can gain access to salmon.
So I have a question, Mike. This summer has been particularly warm. I came to Katmai all ready to be cold and wet, and it's been very dry. We've had almost no rain, and it's been very hot. And so has that affected the timing of when the bears come back, and possibly what's going on in the small streams and rivers where the bears have been fishing for salmon now? I mean, I know that the river levels are extraordinarily low right now. How do all those things affect what we will see on the cameras?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. It's difficult to know for sure, especially, if I don't have the opportunity to investigate some of those other streams firsthand. But since we had such a warm summer in Katmai, and when I was up there at the beginning of July, as you know, Naomi, I mean, for viewers who are tuning in, discovering the bear cams later in the season, the area was experiencing never before seen high temperatures, not just hot temperatures, but like never before hot temperatures. So close to 90 degrees, which is unprecedented for that region. And that really raised the water temperature in the lakes, in the streams. And I think that happened to delay maybe some of the salmon spawning activity, because again, salmon need to lay their eggs in water temperatures that's conducive to incubation, and they want their eggs to hatch at the right time in late winter and early spring next year. So if you lay your eggs in water temperature that's too hot, it's not going to be good for your eggs. And if the water temperature is just too hot for you as an adult salmon, you're going to have a harder time surviving those conditions. So I wonder, and this is just my speculation, but I wonder if a lot of the salmon that would have moved into some of those smaller streams, like in August, just delayed doing so. They hung out in the lakes, in the deeper water in the lakes where it's cooler. They could just kind of go into cold storage in those places, not really expend a lot of energy. And then once they determined that the waters coming off of those mountainsides were cold enough, they could just move in and spawn, maybe just a little bit delayed. And maybe that's keeping some of the bears from traveling back to Brooks River, because they're still finding food in those other areas. But I would expect those runs to, again, end the spawning periods to end, if they haven't ended already, to be ending very shortly, and a lot of bears coming back to the river itself.
Yeah, it has started to get cooler. So I'm hoping that means bears will start coming back. Some bears, as you all in the cams have seen, there's some more bears coming back. So fingers crossed on that.
Right. Every day, I think it's like watching the cams in late June and early July. Every day we can expect to see new bears coming back to the river. And one of the other differences that we're noticing, Naomi, over the past several years is that more and more bears are starting to keep fishing at Brooks Falls in late summer. And that's kind of a new phenomenon as well. When I first started at Katmai, that was not a thing that we normally saw in late summer. Maybe one bear sat up at the falls. Maybe one came through, sat there for a while, and then decided, well, there's no fish here, I'm going to keep on going. But like this August, just like the past in August 2016 and 2017 and 2018, it seems like there's just bears continuing to fish the falls. It's like 747, for example, never left. He just is just sitting there and eating and eating and eating. And I don't know if this is a long-term trend shift that we're seeing. Is it because bears are learning to fish at Brooks Falls in late summer? Is it because there's strong runs of a different species of salmon coming through, silver salmon, sometimes called coho salmon in different parts of North America? All of the bears that I've been seeing on the webcams catching salmon at Brooks Falls have been primarily catching silver salmon. There's been a few sockeyes mixed in there, but they're catching some pretty sizable fish up at Brooks Falls that are nice and silvery so far, that they haven't quite got, they haven't attained their spawning colors yet. So I think those are some of those silver salmon that are part of the late summer arrivals here at Brooks River.
What what I've noticed that every time I've gone to the falls, I don't have the luxury of watching the cams as much as you all do, but there have always been at least 4 bears there, which I think is pretty unusual for past August times. And but what I did notice this August in the lower river is all the sows with cubs moved out. 708 was hanging around for a while longer than everyone else, but they all went someplace else.
Yeah, and that's fairly normal for bears in August. They tend to disperse away from Brooks River, going to those other salmon spawning streams, feeding on salmon there before they end up coming back. And I know people have been asking about certain individual bears that they had seen like in August last year or August 2017, and wondering, hey, well, where are these bears? Are they okay? And I think it's quite normal for those other bears to have dispersed away from Brooks River. That's something that we would normally expect, and most of them have done so. We're seeing a handful of bears or we saw a handful of bears at Brooks Falls throughout August. But considering that the bear monitors documented, I think, remind me if I'm wrong, Naomi, but somewhere around 60 bears during July. Is that right?
Yeah, 63 is the official number.
Okay. Yeah, so when you
Not
consider that
including
we've only been seeing a few of those 60 bears using Brooks Falls and Brooks River in August. So all of those other bears are somewhere else, and I think a lot of them are going to be coming back quite shortly. And I think it's maybe a good opportunity. Sorry, go ahead, Naomi.
No, I just one other question I'd mentioned before about how dry and how low the water level is in the river. I mean, for instance, usually the queue can go in and out of Naknek at this time, but it can't go anywhere now because the water level is low. So how does that affect the salmon and the bears?
Well, in Brooks River, I don't think it's much of a worry for the bears and the salmon, because Brooks River, again, is buffered by Lake Brooks. So there's always going to be some water flowing through it. Enough water, certainly, for salmon to continue their migration and spawning. And actually, it might even make it easier for the bears to catch the fish in Brooks River, because there's less water for the bears to contend with. If you compare pictures of the falls this year versus last year when there was more water. The salmon had a lot more water to escape from bears with. So I think at Brooks River things are going to be kind of a-okay. And if you end up getting a lot more rain over the next few weeks, we might see the water level increase in Brooks River quite significantly as the Lake Brooks basin starts to fill back up. But I think maybe this could be a good opportunity, Naomi, to take a few questions. I think throughout the month of September, bears are becoming more numerous. I think that's one of the key takeaways that we want to give you from this chat, as other salmon runs sort of play out across the area. And the greatest number of bears at Brooks River often occurs at the end of September in early October. So look for more and more bears to come back to Brooks River throughout the month. And bears, again, experience a profound hunger at this time of the year. So that's something that we can think about, them experiencing something that we can think about, but we can't actually physically experience in the same way. They just don't feel full, as Naomi explained, when they're going through that hyperphagic period. So they just don't have that feeling of fullness, and they keep eating and eating and eating and eating. And Brooks River offers brown bears, I think, really the last opportunity for bears to satisfy that hunger. And Naomi, would you be willing to stick around and try to answer a few questions here?
Sure, if I can.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if you have the chat channel pulled up, but I have it here. So I'm going to try to look through the queue here just quickly. I think some of these, we answered, during the chat. The first one, how long do salmon live after spawning? Again, maybe just a few days to a week, just to, reiterate that point. So once they move into the river, and spawn, they have expended nearly all of their energy. And on the underwater cameras, that's something to watch for. It's just to look for a salmon just drifting by, almost zombie-like. It has almost no energy left. So just a few days after spawning, that's probably the rest of their life expectancy after that. And how can I? A related question to that, Naomi, is how can one tell if a salmon has spawned or not? So if you're watching the underwater camera, not only maybe behaviorally looking for those salmon drifting downstream listlessly, but what are those other sort of physical features that that we can look for?
Well, the fact that they're, we see. Well, we see the color has changed. They actually look kind of. People said this zombie-like. They look aged. They look ragged. The fungus, that white stuff that we see on so many salmon, when they're still coming through, there might be more of that. They look more skeletal. Again, they're losing. They haven't eaten since they've come back to fresh water. So they are on death's door, and you can see that.
Yeah, definitely look for. We had a couple of photos of some spawned out and dead salmon earlier in the broadcast. Look for just an overall high level of wear on their bodies, like this tail. Yeah, this is a tail fin of a female sockeye salmon. This is one that I found in Brooks River last summer. Kind of pulled up on the bank so I could take photographs of it. When they're digging their nest, they're using their tails. They don't have any other tools to do it with, so they really just kind of shred themselves on the river gravel trying to spawn. So again, looking on the underwater camera, look for those signs of wear and tear on the fish itself. So that's I think one of the better things to look for. Yeah, overall, like Naomi, you said fungal infections too. A lot of those things are going to be signs overall that the fish is spent and about to die. Naomi, have you seen any females with cubs visiting the river recently?
I haven't. 708 and her cubs were the last ones I saw. It's been subadults on the lower river and the usual mix of the big guys and subadults at the falls. It is interesting though that I have seen, because of the lower water level, I have seen subadults begin to find dead fish in the lower river because they can almost stand there. So we're beginning to see that, but no family groups.
Okay, yeah, that was a question or a related question to one that was posted in our queue. We talked about how we can expect to see more bears arriving at Brooks River right now. And the mothers and cubs, we can certainly expect those bears to show up and start using the lower Brooks River like they had earlier in the year. But we just, haven't seen any yet. I haven't seen any on the cams, and I was just kind of wondering if you had seen any as well. Let's see.
No.
And Naomi, I'm not sure if you've had any discussions with the other Explorer staff, if the cams are going to be, or do you have an estimate on when the bear cams might be shut down this year?
I don't. I think it's a discussion with the park because, again, the falls cams are run on solar power. So we need sun for that, and the days are sadly getting a lot shorter. But the cams on the bridge have direct power, and so we need to the maintenance people here to find out when they're going to actually shut those off. They start closing down camp after the lodge closes on the 19th, but there still will be power, and maybe it'll be reduced out. That's something I'll find out for you all.
Yeah, once the lodge closes, there's a lot of prep work that has to be done to make sure that all the facilities and everything are winterized. So the pipes don't burst, things of that nature, because no one stays at Brooks River typically throughout the winter time to serve as a caretaker. So the visitor center at Brooks Camp is going to stay open until around the beginning of October. Is that right? So there will be, I think, power on
Yes.
To power at least the lower river cameras. Until then, we might start to experience some limited hours on the Brooks Falls cam and the Dumpling Mountain cam, just because of the limited amount of daylight. It's amazing how dark it gets, how quickly it gets at Brooks River. When you're used to seeing it like in June, and you have almost unlimited daylight. You can go outside at all hours without a flashlight, even though the sun might not be above the horizon during all hours. But this time of the year, it's dark. It gets really, really dark. So definitely, if you're coming to Brooks River in September, bring a headlamp or a flashlight, something, because it will be quite dark.
Yeah, it's like dark at almost 7:15, 7:30 now. So got that headlamp out.
And we'll get, I think, just to a few more questions in our queue here. One of them I'm going to save till last, but people over the last couple of years have been wondering about a bear who's numbered 809. He would be what, about 4.5 years old, I think, right now. You don't, if you were able to talk to the bear monitoring staff, did they mention 809, or had he been seen this year? I don't think he's been seen on the cams as far as I know.
No, 809 hasn't been seen this year.
Okay.
And they said he wasn't seen last year. Being a cam viewer, I believe I saw him last year, and it was both how he looked and behavior. He was sitting in his usual spot at the entrance to the floating bridge. But that's not normally a spot where bear monitors monitor bears. So, but someone else recently asked about 809, and we haven't seen 809, but there'll be some new 809s soon, because 273, his mom has three spring cubs.
Right, and if you're not familiar with that bear, 809 is the offspring of 273, who is back this year with 3 spring cubs. And that cub 809, he sort of endeared himself to a lot of bear camp fans with a lot of very curious and playful behavior. So people, I think, were looking forward to watching him grow up. But with subadult bears, especially subadult males, it's not uncommon for them to just to disperse away from their mother's home range, and not share any part of that home range with their mom. So I kind of wonder, if something didn't happen to him, like he got injured or got sick and died or whatever, if he's still out there as a healthy bear, I suspect that maybe he's not at Brooks River because he just dispersed away from his mother's home range, and that's not uncommon for male subadult bears, especially females. In contrast, they tend to stick around their mother's home range a bit more. They'll overlap a lot more um, with their mother as they mature into adults. But males, they tend to try to they get itchy feet for whatever reason, wanderlust, and they are not nearly as homebodies. Although we do see exceptions. We see like 503 was raised along Brooks River. Number 89 Backpack was raised along Brooks River, and they come back to Brooks Falls each year. So there are exceptions to it, of course. But that's my best guess is why he's not here, why 809 is not around. I think he might have just dispersed away from the river itself. And Naomi, have you seen?
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
No, I was going to say research shows that males, young males, do tend to leave their home ground much more, and it's one of the reasons that we have more female bears here than we do male bears. And when you think about it, human tribes did that too. Males will go out to other places to find better opportunities because they're too much competition. So maybe 809 is being a more dominant subadult someplace else. So you were about to ask me who I'd seen?
Yeah, somebody was actually wondering if 505's sick yearling had been seen at all. They were just wondering if you had any updates on that bear. And before you answer that question, let me throw out some background information on that bear. So 505 is an adult female raising her first litter. She arrived this year with 2 yearlings, and one of her yearlings appeared to just get sick. We don't know what it was suffering from, what sort of ailment or disease, but it wasn't able to keep up with mom and its sibling. So it ended up getting separated and just going about its business on its own. A lot of us thought it was, maybe going to die because it just wasn't moving at all or hardly at all. But then eventually just kind of got up and started wandering away. So again, we don't know its fate right now, unless Naomi, you've seen it. And that's what somebody is wondering. Has anyone seen 505's, abandoned or separated cub?
I haven't. I saw that cub in the lower river catching before August, catching some fish scraps and being around other subadults, but I haven't. Ranger Michael walked in and out. I was going to ask him if he'd seen that bear, but I haven't seen that bear. But I am on the lookout for that bear because it's pretty amazing that that cub survived. And Mike, you've spoken to this many times about how resilient bears can be, and that one seemed to be catching fish and doing well. And I really hope that we see that cub soon.
In many brown bears in different parts of the world are emancipated as yearlings. So I think that it doesn't happen often in Katmai. In fact, I can only think of one instance where that sort of purposefully happened, and that was with 503, and then he ended up getting adopted by another bear. So that's another story for another time. But in Scandinavia and populations of bears that have been studied in Sweden, a lot of those bears are emancipated as yearlings. And that's typically what happens in black bears, North American black bears. So bears have the capacity to survive as yearlings, but maybe it just increases the odds just a little bit. And then just kind of a question about 747. Somebody was wondering if 747 could be sticking around to conserve energy, since there are some fish, at the falls, and you wouldn't have to burn calories by to other locations. And that's what I think. I mean, I think there's enough salmon around just for 747 to make a living where he is, and that's been Brooks Falls for the past like what 8 or whatever it is. You know, why leave if you can make a living? And he's so big and he's so dominant. He's good at fishing that he probably doesn't have to go seek out other opportunities elsewhere. And I think that is partly reflective of his overall girth. I mean, he is so big right now. And Naomi, you've had a chance to see him in person recently, so he must be an impressive sight.
He is so big. And another reason I'll just postulate, but I have no idea if it's true, he can barely move. So if you were his size and you had to move that girth around, I don't think you'd want to move very far to fish. You know, if you can sit in the jacuzzi. I mean, the other day, I don't know if you were able to see it on the cams, but I could see it from the platform. Um, he was lying down above upriver of the falls and taking a little nap there. I just think it's tough for him to move around. So staying in one spot is probably a good idea for that bear.
Right. When you're that big, you tend to get overheated very quickly if you're a brown bear. So yeah, I mean that's probably one reason why we see them moving very slowly and staying in the water for long periods of time at this time of the year, because they just tend to get overheated, even though the water might only be in the lower 60s or the 50s, just or lower if the air temperature drops down even more. They're still really big animals. They've been eating so much food. They have like this big fermentation tank, um, going on in their digestive tract. So they tend to get overheated, and they don't tend to move around all that much. Um, but yeah, I think that might be a good time, a good note to conclude the chat on. Naomi, somebody is wondering if you and Barbara can go out on a boat with a bullhorn and tell the bears it's time to return. I think a lot of viewers, including myself, are quite anxious to see more bears on the bear cams. And then somebody was wondering, where's my
All
hat?
right.
Well, my
We do
hat's right
that.
here. I decided not to wear it, but it's right here in case anybody wanted to see it, just in case the sun got too bright. I did have it with me, so if people are missing it, there it is. I didn't want to leave you without it. But again,
What's the
Naomi,
chat
thank you
without
for
that hat?
right. So Naomi, thank you for joining me on the chat today. You have another chat lined up in just a couple of days.
Yeah, we're going to be talking to Ranger Nick, who is part of the bear management team. And, we're going to find out just what bear management is. And you guys don't get to see that because most bear management happens in camp and we don't have cameras here. So I'm really looking forward to bringing Ranger Nick to you. You will enjoy that chat, I think.
I think so. Yeah, I'm looking forward to watching it as well. So what day and time will that be?
That will be this Friday, September 6th at 10 a.m. Alaska time, 11 a.m. Pacific. And what's that? 2 p.m.
That's
Eastern.
yep. Right. That's a lot of math to do when you're trying to think in 3 or 4 time zones.
A lot of math. Okay.
But again, Naomi, yeah, thanks for joining me today. Again, my name is Mike Fitz with explore.org. We'll be back online soon to talk more brown bears and salmon with everyone. Thanks for joining us today.